So let us focus now on this amazing chapter in the book of Daniel. Chapter 5, and as I've said, verses 22 and 23. Daniel, he is 84 years of age at this time. Whether you might say he's an old man, but if he is, he's a saintly old man. Well, whether you say to yourself, oh, that's young. Well, he's young, certainly in heart, and he hasn't lost his mental ability. He's able to stand up in this great hall where you've got the king, where you've got all these princes and all their wives and all the women that are there. But the king, I doubt if he can sit down because he's so frightened. He's shaking. And he's had this terrible experience, so frightening him that his knees are knocking one to another. So you've got to imagine yourself, a man with a sort of white face, frightened, almost out of his wits. And he's been waiting some while. What's these words on the white wall? I wish somebody would tell me, what are these words on the white wall? Meanie, tekel you fasten. And what's this business about two fingers? Not a hand, but two fingers of a hand. Because if you write, like I often do, you can write with just two fingers. Or a thumb and a finger, you can write. And that's what he suddenly saw. Well, the only person out of the whole of their country is Daniel. The only person. Why? Because here is a man who knows God. And behind those words is God giving a final message, not just to the king, specifically to the king, but also to the whole empire. Well, this Daniel has been brought in, and we are told he began to speak after the king had said to him, oh, you're a slave, aren't you? That my father, he means grandfather, brought from Babylon. I've heard of you. So this king Belshazzar doesn't really know Belteshazzar, which is the Babylonian name given to Daniel. He doesn't really know him, although they've lived together in one sense, because Daniel, Belteshazzar, came ever so close to Nebuchadnezzar, because in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, he was a young man. At the age of 17, he was taken from Jerusalem when he was about 14, and he was put in the University of Babylon because he was a brilliant student, and he spent 3 years, so he was about 17 when you read about him in chapter 1. But of course the years have gone by. But Daniel sat near to the king, Nebuchadnezzar. He had a high position. Yes, but once Nebuchadnezzar had died, he was alive. And then there was another king who was the father of this Belshazzar, which explains why, when he's making a promise, if somebody can interpret these words, I will give him robe of scarlet. I will put round his neck golden chain, and he will be the third in the kingdom. And you say to yourself, why the third? Well, his father is Nabonidus, and he rules with his father. So you've already got two rulers working together, though the emphasis in this chapter is on Belshazzar. Well, here's Daniel, all these years later, 84 years of age, and there he stands in front of the king, and there's 1,000, at least 1,000 people in this great hall. And he doesn't speak with a microphone. There weren't any microphones in those days. But he speaks, and he speaks so loudly and so clearly that he's addressing the king, but everybody hears what he says. So that's my text this evening, verse 22. Let me read it to you, and verse 23 before I carry on. Thou, Belshazzar, son of grandfather Nebuchadnezzar, have you not humbled your heart, though you knew all these things that are mentioned, of course, in chapters 2 and 3 and 4? But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. That's a dangerous thing to do. Absolutely dangerous. Lift up thyself against the Lord of heaven. And they, because you asked them to, have brought the vessels of the Lord of heaven's house in Jerusalem that were stolen by Nebuchadnezzar. You brought these vessels into this hall, thou, your wives, your lords, your concubines, in order to drink wine from them. And you have praised, this is the shocking thing, you have praised the gods of silver, gold, brass, iron, wood, stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, because they're nothing. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. God is angry with you. And so he's written with the fingers of a man's hand these 4 words. So this is the last day of that man's life, though he doesn't know it. He's been feasting. He's not been thinking about the future and about when he dies. He's been feasting. He made this big organization. Let's have a big, massive party. Drinking is a joy. That's why a lot of people go to the public house. And why a lot of people drink and then get drunk. And that, of course, makes you a drunken person. And that's a sin. So, this man, without knowing it, is now having the last day of his life. And it happens in this great big hall. That you see, he got to the position where he so angered God with his arrogance and pride that God said, as it were, that's the last straw. You crossed the line. You are to die. And although God is terribly, terribly patient with all of us, once anybody, whoever, actually crosses a line where they've really gone over the top in their rebellion against God, in their insulting of God and so on, then they can expect something quite bad, quite drastic, quite sudden. And that's what happened at the end of Daniel chapter 5. That night, it says, that night. Doesn't say how many hours he was asleep in his bed, whether he was in bed drunk or not, doesn't say that. It just says, in that night, this king Belshazzar was slain. So 70 years have now come to an end. You see, when Daniel and his 3 friends were taken in chapter 1 to Babylon, this was all because God had said earlier to Jeremiah, my people are so shocking in that they're worshipping idols, all kinds of idols. And the first commandment is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And yet you're the people, God is saying to them, who promised, you are our God and we will do what you say. But now, all these years later, they've gone from bad to worse, and so they're under judgment. So what was the judgment? You're going to be taken into exile. You're going to be taken away from Jerusalem. You're going to go into a city called Babylon, full of idols. And you're going to live amongst these idols 70 years. That's why I say Daniel is now 84. Because he went at the age of 14. He did 3 years in university. And then there was all these years of exile. But suddenly, the Babylonian Empire is now having its own judgment. So, 2 things to say to you tonight. One is, I want you to appreciate this chapter as a historical event in the life of Daniel and in the life of the history of Babylon. You see, these things are all historically true. So when you read the Bible, you need to say to yourself, now, is this telling me history? Is this telling me facts? If so, I must believe them, from Genesis right through to the end of the Bible. And so the first half of the book of Daniel is all to do with historical facts. When you come to chapter 7 onwards, that's to deal with prophecies, predictions concerning the future, and especially that one day, in the days of the Roman Empire, God will set up his kingdom and something amazing will happen. A little baby boy will be born who is God in flesh, come to save sinners. But I come to this chapter. It's factual. God does speak to us through the events of history. God does not change. He still hates pride as he hates the devil, who has risen up from the beginning against God. People who are under the influence of the devil come under God's condemnation unless they repent and then seek forgiveness. So I just want to emphasize first the facts, and then secondly the lessons that you and I can learn. And under those lessons, of course, will be, don't ignore the Bible. Beware of ignoring the Bible. This is what millions of people in our country that years ago all read the Bible. Little children were taught the Bible by their parents. There weren't all these other books or television or smartphones and all the rest of it. It was the Bible. But how many millions of people in this country now read the Bible? And I'm saying beware. If you ignore the Bible, you're still guilty of not reading what God has been pleased to tell us. And that's serious. To come before God and be told, you never read my book. You never thought about your soul. You never thanked me for your food and your blessings. A shocking thing to be under the judgment of God and all to do with not even opening the Bible or going to a Bible preaching church. And so the lessons I want to bring to you are in my second part. And so let me say briefly, please imagine this whole picture. Here's a feast for rich people. Here's a feast which involves lots of eating and drinking. So the emphasis seems to be on pleasure. But what they don't know is that this is the last day that the kingdom will exist. Because that night, the king is going to be slain. And that night, a new empire will arise, the Medes and the Persians. But imagine, if you can, the organisation involved. You've got to have food for 1,000 people or more. You've got to have staff. You've got to have waiters and waitresses. You've got to have chefs. You've got 1,000 people to be fed. And you've got glasses on the table, whether it's one glass for every person or 2 glasses or 3, I have no idea. But they've got to drink out of something. And while this feast of eating and drinking is going on, we're told the king stands up. He's perhaps already getting a little bit tipsy or drunk, and he says, "Bring in the golden and silver vessels that my grandfather brought from Jerusalem. Bring them in." Whether there were 1,000 of them, I don't know. Whether everybody had a vessel, either of gold or silver or whatever, I don't know. It could be one for every table. And then they could fill them with wine. And then he would stand up, you see, and he would say, "Let's drink now to the God of gold." And they'd all stand up, having had wine put in their glass, and they would then stand up and give praise to the God of gold, then sit down. Then, of course, it would happen with silver. Then it would go on with iron and wood and stone. So 6 times. Just have another toast, another toast, another toast, so that everybody gets more and more inebriated. And so you can imagine the atmosphere in this great hall. And of course the king is present. So if the king is present, there's great honour and great respect for the king. However bad he is, you have to be very respectful before a king or a queen. But the interesting thing, thinking of the facts, is that Daniel does not attend this banquet. Whether he got an invitation, I doubt. Why? Because he was wary of what we call the world, and of the flesh, and of the devil. That's not my place. I prefer to be in my room, either working or praying or reading the scriptures. But he knew what was going on, because he speaks when he comes in before the king. He can relate and say, "You've been doing this and you've been doing that," etc. And as I said, he spoke for everybody to hear without a microphone. But he's honouring the great high God. They're the facts. And if you can't remember them, then I say, please, read Daniel 5 for yourself. Get the picture in your mind. Because there's a warning here, as well as a message which says, don't forget to repent and ask God for his salvation. And so I come secondly this evening to the lessons. Well, what are the lessons we are to learn? Well, there are 5. First of all, look at this man Belshazzar. I don't know how old he is, but he's the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, and his father, Nabonidus, is probably fighting a war against the Medes and the Persians. So he's probably somewhere outside. But inside, Belshazzar, whose name means protect the king, is having a feast. And you think to yourself, is this a time for feasting when you've got a war going on out there? And when you don't realise quite who's going to win and who's going to lose? And what may happen tomorrow? It's like saying, oh, I don't want to think about tomorrow, just enjoy myself. There was the title of a book, wasn't there, written some years ago, Amusing Ourselves to Death. And you think, is that what people in our country are doing today? Amusing themselves to death? They just want to eat and drink and be merry. You've got all these young people, Friday nights and Saturday nights, clubbing and doing all kinds of things, and falling out in the early hours of the morning drunk on the streets, and people having to be there to see they get home safely. I think the picture is appalling. The way in which the flesh is taking over and pleasure is taking over, and the thought of, am I living for the glory of God, never seems to enter into people's minds. This is surely our country. And yet it was more Christian than it certainly is now. There were these marvellous people who translated and gave their life in giving us the Bible in English and so on. Well, here's Belshazzar. There's a war on, but he's partying. Pleasure's the big thing. And of course it's all coupled with the fact he's got power and riches, and so he can organise all this, although there may be a lot of people in the country who are poor, never could have a proper meal while there's all these people feasting. So what's the lesson about Belshazzar? Beware of pride. Beware of overemphasis on pleasure. Beware that the devil isn't influencing your life or mine. Beware. I say in Jesus, please save me and protect me. So there are lessons in looking at this king. Then secondly, fingers of a man's hand. It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? Quite extraordinary to picture this great hall with white walls and a candlestick here and another candlestick there and lights all over the place, but especially behind the king on the wall there is this brightness, a candlestick with blazing lights, and as he's drinking, suddenly the fingers of a man's hand appear on the wall, writing, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, all in Arabic. So I say to you, you may, as many people, ignore God, never think about God, never say thank you to God for my daily bread, and so on. But God is. God is. And God is to be glorified. And God can do all kinds of things to startle and shake you and me. Because immediately these fingers had written and these words appeared, we're told the king saw and was silenced. Suddenly he's in shock. Suddenly he may be a powerful man, but he's frightened so terribly that his knees are knocking together. And he's almost having to either sit down or put his hand on something to steady himself because he's absolutely frightened. Which reminds me of the title of of a book by Dr. Gary Williams, Small Creatures with Sin-Darkened Minds, is the title of this chapter. And it's true, every one of us is a small creature in comparison to God, with sin-darkened minds. So God doesn't have to do much to shake you. At least I wouldn't expect so. God is that powerful that he can use all kinds of things. Just do something small, and it can shake a nation. It can shake you or me. So here's a scene of a man terrified, and of course it affects the whole of the 1,000 guests. What can they do? Watching the king, looking at the words. So he commands, bring in the wise men, please, wise men, I give you riches, and I give you scarlet, and I make one of you third ruler of the kingdom, if you can interpret. And they all come rushing in. Yes, sire, yes, sire, yes, sire. And they look, and of course they can't do anything because they don't understand what it says. And so we're told there's this shock and silence. Remember, God can do anything he will in order to stop us in our tracks, in order to call us. So if we listen to his call, that's the best thing of all. But if not, he may send pain, or he may send catastrophe. He may shout, as C.S. Lewis says, shout to say, think, stop. Say to yourself, where am I going? What's the future? Have I got an inheritance in God? Or do I just think of myself all the time? God is a sovereign God. And as it says here, in whose hand is the breath of every one of us. Beware of not glorifying God. And so we're told, proceeding in this story, thirdly, the Queen Mother comes in because she's heard about what's gone on in the big hall, and that the wise men couldn't do anything. There's rumours going all around that city. The king's terrified. Nobody can help. And she says, but I know a man. I know my history. I know what happened in the days of Nebuchadnezzar. I know about Daniel chapter 2 and chapter 3 and chapter 4. And so we're told that the Queen Mother comes in and says to the king, "O king, live forever. Don't get too upset. Don't get too upset. There is a man in the kingdom whom your father called Belteshazzar, and he's got an excellent spirit, and he can interpret dreams. He's the only man I know," she seems to be saying. "Call for him." And that's what happens. They call for this man, Belteshazzar. So thank God when there's somebody around who knows their history and who can see where there is a man or somebody to whom you can go for help. Thank God for people who know the Bible and who can answer questions. And so we come fourthly to Daniel. But Daniel, as you know, has been given the name by Nebuchadnezzar all those years previously called Belteshazzar, meaning my God, which is Bel. Bel's the god of Babylon. Daniel, because he was so brilliant, when the king interviewed him, said, "I'm going to call you Belteshazzar." So he was called, but it's really Daniel, of course. Well, he comes in, and we are told, aren't we, that the king speaks to him as if, "I don't know you too well, but I hear of you," and so on, which shows that the godly man wasn't very attracted to Belshazzar, and Belshazzar never thought much about him, even though he had done so much for his grandfather. But Daniel speaks, having taken everything in. He's the wise man of those days. And so when he at last gets the chance to speak, he says something like, "O king, you can keep your gifts. I'm not looking for scarlet or gold, or to be the third ruler. You can give those to whom you will. But," he says, "let me take you over your history. You knew this history, but you never learned anything from it." But he reminded him of what we've got in these earlier chapters of the book of Daniel. And then, of course, he says, "You, O Belshazzar, you have not humbled yourself before this high God. You have despised history. You have despised things that you should have known. And you've even insulted God in this shocking way." And so then, having rebuked him, spoken straight to him, he then says, "I will interpret these 4 words.